Welcome everyone to Creating a Family, talk about adoption and foster care. I'm Dawn Davenport. I am the host as well as the Executive Director of Creating a Family. We are the national education and support for adoptive, kinship, and foster families. Today we're going to be talking about how to raise an anti-racist child with Dr. Hazzard. She is a clinical child psychologist who is on the faculty at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. She is the co-author of Something Happened in Our Town, a child's story about racial injustice. We'll be also talking with Dr. Joy Harris. She is a full-time lecturer at the Princeton Theological Seminary. She has her PhD in communication and culture, and she is the co-author of The ABCs of Diversity, Helping Kids and Ourselves Embrace Our Differences. Welcome, Dr. Harris and Dr. Hazzard, to Creating a Family. We are so glad to have you here today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We are going to be focusing our talk today on how to help white parents raising white kids. Now, we recognize that many in our community are white and black parents raising kids of color. Some of the information shared will be relevant, and many of the resources, especially if we talk about children's books, will be relevant. But a few resources that we would recommend that are more specific to raising black and brown kids would include the embracerace.org website. It was founded by a black and mixed race parents to provide resources for raising black kids. Another great resource is a website called One Talk at a Time, and you can just Google that, just One Talk at a Time. I'm going to quickly give you, it's got what we call an unfriendly URL, an ugly URL. It's not an easy one to remember. It will be in the show notes, guys. So and we will embed it in the show notes. That would be the easier way, or just Google One Talk at a Time. And they provide support for African American, Asian American, and Latinx Americans to talk with their kids about race and ethnicity. And the thing I really like about their website is they recognize that talk and the issues faced by each of those demographics is different. And so they have a separate section for Black, Asian, and Latinx parents. So I like both of those resources very much. So we are going to be jumping into talking about now focusing on how white parents can help raise anti-racist kids. And as white families, and I speak as a white parent, we have the luxury or the privilege of ignoring the issue of race and racism because it makes us uncomfortable. And maybe also because we assume it doesn't affect us or our kids. But that is absolutely not the case. Racism dehumanizes every one of us, and it also destabilizes us and our families. So the question we're going to tackle today is how to raise an anti-racist child. And I think I want to begin with the difference between, because one of the things we will often hear is people saying, in fact, we've heard it recently in the news, is that I am not a racist, or I'm not a racist. But what's the difference between not being a racist and being anti-racist? Dr. Harris, let me begin with you.
Anti-racism. I think that being an anti-racist first would mean acknowledging that you have some form of privilege, especially if you are a person who is white or identifies as white, that you have some type of privilege and that you work toward or consistently work toward breaking down the systems of oppression that hinder and that do not assist in promoting equality amongst people.
Okay, so that's the fundamental distinction. And ultimately, that's what we want. We
Right.
want to raise anti-racist. We want to raise the bar.
Right.
So excellent. Dr. Hazzard, we will often also hear people who will say, and this is almost exclusively white people saying, love is going to conquer all. We're all one race. We're just the human race. What's wrong with saying that? Why is that not helpful?
Well, a couple reasons. First, that shuts down the conversation about race and gives children the feeling that this isn't something we can talk about. It's it's an ideal, and we are all part of the human race, but it's ignoring the reality that race does impact people in our society, and if we don't talk about that, we're colluding with that. And that's in your first question about not being a racist, and everybody's real scared to talk about that because that is a dirty word and a horrible accusation. But the reality is that we all were raised in America. We all, Beverly Daniel Tatum has a beautiful phrase of, we all breathe the smog of racism. So even those of us who consciously don't have negative ideas about people of other races, the likelihood is that unconsciously we do. And that part of working to be an anti-racist, as Dr. Harris said, is being willing to examine that as well as to understand more about structural racism, which I think we'll get into as we keep talking.
It also feels like it's undermining our Black and brown fellow parents. It's not recognizing their life experience of all being part of the human race. That may not be how they experience it. Dr. Harris, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, right before we began in explaining sort of my training, culture, communication, and culture, and I think Dr. Hazzard started to, talk about this, is that our behaviors, the things that we say, the things that we do, whether consciously or unconsciously, are always speaking. We can't help but to communicate. And so the parents, the Black parents, who are raising children regardless of their ethnicity, are also having, an interesting, maybe having an experience depending on, sort of where they fall socioeconomically, and their voices also, need to be heard and to be lifted. But yes, our communication, how we interact, is constantly speaking, whether we're conscious of it or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Particularly the whether we're conscious of it or not part, right? All right, so we decided that the best way to approach this is to give you practical tips. This is not going to be a pie in the sky discussion. We're going to try to break this down into practical tips that you as a parent can implement to help raise an anti-racist child. Our first tip is going to be talk about race. I think it is well known that racism thrives in silence. But the truth is, many white parents are hesitant to raise the topic. Why do you think that is, Dr. Hazzard?
I think many white parents are feel uncomfortable because their parents didn't talk about it with them. And I'm going to talk about well-meaning parents that weren't raised in an atmosphere of explicit racism. Although that would complicate it too if you're, but anyway.
Another level of complication.
Yes, another level of complication, but they feel uncomfortable. They are scared to say the wrong thing. Most white parents research and sort of my own experience, and I'll raise my hand and say, I raised my grown daughter with a fairly colorblind philosophy, which is what the term that's used to describe parents who really don't talk about race and kind of give that message of, we're all the same. But they just don't talk explicitly about race or racism. We've been trying that approach for maybe the past whatever so many years, and it hasn't been effective in making changes in our society. It's mostly, it's colluding with the status quo. It's giving our kids the message that we're kind of okay with how things are because we're not speaking about it, and we're certainly not speaking out against it.
And I'll just throw in, as also a white parent, that we're afraid of doing it wrong. We're afraid of saying something wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that fear keeps us silent. So our
Mhm.
first tip is to overcome the fear, and because by not saying something, you are part of the problem. So
Yeah,
we
and
are part
just
of the problem.
accept you are going to make mistakes.
Right.
Parents make mistakes in all sorts of areas, and certainly in an area that you don't have much experience or knowledge in.
Mhm.
But as long as you have if your heart's in the right place and you're willing to learn from your mistakes, you're going to get plenty of do-overs because it's not just one conversation.
Right.
Well, yeah, we're going to come to that. Yeah, in fact, that's a part we certainly want to highlight. Dr. Harris, when do children start to recognize racial differences? When does race become an issue for children that they start becoming cognizant of it?
Well, I think that there's a lot of research that really points to the fact that kids start recognizing difference as early as 5, 6 months old, right?
Mhm.
And and so we know that they are recognizing difference just based off of their first sort of institution, which is their family and the people who are surrounding that family. Um, as kids get a little bit older, somewhere around the toddler stage, I think they begin to um, uh, notice, or at least are able to verbalize sort of what they notice or what they see. And then, of course, by the time you're in middle school, junior high school, it's very clear. So noticing difference happens very early on, and that in and of itself is not necessarily negative. What becomes negative is the after, the attitudes and the beliefs and the behaviors that come along over time with that. If I could just, interject something from the last question about the silence. One thing I think is that it's important for parents, particularly white parents, to know is that the silence, people are dying in the midst of the silence. And so while silence communicates, right? And in this instance, it kills. The second thing that I wanted to note, to maybe even articulate a little bit more clearly some of what you both have uh, raised as it relates to white parents' hesitancy is acknowledgement of the privilege, right? The privilege that they have to talk about it or not talk about it. The second is the guilt, right? That comes along. Well, I didn't ask to be born white, and so I have it, and so what do I do? So guilt. And then the third thing is the cost, right? The cost of having the conversation. What does that mean? Whether it is, or standing up, right, for someone, what does that mean? I find that those are the three implicit things that keep people silent. It's acknowledging that they have the privilege to begin with, the
Mhm.
guilt that comes along with that, and then the cost, particularly those who desire to be allies and stand with Black lives or people of color in general.
Dr. Harris, what do you mean when you say the cost?
So the cost, oftentimes, people are talking about, especially right now, about allies. Um, but just like in Black history, we talk about the Underground Railroad and that there were these stops. People paid prices for being an ally. And I think oftentimes that is usually, what do I lose? Sometimes it's social capital. Sometimes it's the end with, how am I going to be perceived? If it's family, then it's the relationships. Does this mean now that we have a strained relationship because we don't see eye to eye? And I think those are just some examples of costs that may not necessarily readily come to the surface, but are playing in the background, particularly for white parents.
Hmm. I think
Or
that
even the cost of, as Black activists have been doing throughout history, putting your physical well-being on the line
Yeah.
in a protest.
Yeah.
yeah, all of those. So when should parents, Dr. Hazzard, when should parents begin talking with their children about race?
Very young. I think as toddlers, as kids are noticing, just like they notice different hair colors, they notice boys versus girls, although maybe as we get more gender neutral in our clothing and toy choices, that'll be less in your face. But they notice concrete attributes of people and things, and they're interested in them. So just being able to comment in a matter-of-fact way about differences in skin color, and in a way that, hey, that's interesting, that's cool that we have all these different colors, is where it can naturally begin.
So, Dr. Harris, how would you recommend beginning this conversation?
So I think a lot of times I would say, as a parent of a 5-year-old and a 4-year-old, interest. When they start to, notice certain things or say things, you have to get ready to respond. And sometimes it's not easy. I talk about it in the book, but, my 4-year-old, called, I wasn't sure if it was a man or a woman, but called it the opposite gender. And is that a man? She said, and I was like, oh my God. And as the elevator is closing, and so I had to.
And no doubt she said it loud.
Right. I thought we had escaped because we had gotten out of the elevator without anything being said. But as the elevator was closing, actually it was my son. He announces, "Mommy, is that a man or a woman?" And I was just like, "Oh, Father, help me, please." So, and I had to get over myself in the moment.
Yeah, exactly.
And I had to say, well, what do you think? And I asked him, so what did he think? And I let him tell me what he think and what he noticed. And I said, you could be right. I'm not sure. And that's okay, because they were being neighborly. They said hello and we said hello back. And I kind of just left it at that. So I think that children drive the conversation. Children also show you their interest. Another short thing that I talk about in the book is we were on the Long Island Railroad because we're in Queens, New York. And a young boy who was about the same age, same height, he was Asian and German. And he saw my son and he crossed the aisle from his mom. His dad and I were sitting on the same side, crossed the aisle and sat down next to my son. And they just, they were intrigued by each other, and it just shows that they were ready to have those kind of conversations, to show those interests. And I think that you watch your child and you allow them to ask those questions, but that requires being present. So I think as children show interest, I think as the historical moments happen, as we're in this watershed moment right now, you make a moment to try to address something, whether it's the Sesame Street 20-minute town hall or a book. So there are ways for parents to be intentional, but also to allow the child's interest and questions to help guide those discussions.
I'm glad you raised children's books. I am, and actually everyone here at Creating a Family, we all tend to be a little fanatical about children's literature. I really love children's literature, and for many reasons. But one of the reasons is the power it has of aiding discussions that parents want to avoid, as well as the power of if you're talking about diversifying, the power to help you as a parent do that. So I'm going to recommend a couple of, throughout this, check out our anti-racist parenting guide. And in that, we're going to be including these tips, but we're also going to be including specific books as well as parenting resources for you to utilize. And there will be some of the best of the books, mostly for children, but also for parents. And I also wanted to share three resources that I think are so helpful for parents who want to diversify both their children's library, their home library, what books they buy, but also what books they get from the library. And that's what we're going to encourage you to do, is make certain that you have diversity in the books you're reading to your children. And you want to have Black and brown main characters, as well as Asian main characters, as well as Muslim and Jewish. We want to show diversity across, but you also can get books that are specific to talking about racism and white privilege and protest and some things we'll be talking about. So the three resources I want to tell you about, one is called Diverse Book Finder, and it is a treasure trove of finding. They have analyzed, I don't even know how many books, all children's books, based on, and they have all these categories that you can choose, whether it's Black main character, whether it is Hispanic or Latinx main character, East Asian. Then they also have books that talk about multiracial characters or children crossing racial divides. You name the category, they got the book, and then they give you a brief review of it. A really, really good resource, diversebookfinder.org. The next one is the Brown Bookshelf. And that is the website. And it highlights own voices, Black authors and brown authors that share the ethnicity of the characters they write about. So that's another one. And the last one is The Conscious Kid, another great resource for finding books that for your child. And The Conscious Kid actually also has I don't think they call it a book of the month, but it's something like that for specific types of books you may be looking for. So you can buy your books there as well. Excellent. Okay, thank you. What other ways, before we move off of this topic, what other ways can you think of that parents can start the conversation? Dr. Harris has already mentioned, follow your child's lead, pay attention to what they're interested in and answer their questions. And then I've talked about books as a way in. Any other thoughts, Dr. Hazzard, for how we can, as white parents, make certain that we're talking with our kids about race?
A couple of additional thoughts. One is be intentional. I mean, I guess a broader point is think about diversity as an element of what you're considering when you make choices about everything: where you live, what school you go to, where you enroll your child in extracurricular activities.
What pediatrician you use, what
Yes, what
orthodontist you
professionals you
use.
use.
Yes.
Exactly. If you end up in a neighborhood that doesn't have as much diversity that as would be ideal, you can certainly be intentional about exposing your child to diversity in activities that you do as a family, festivals that you go to, museums that you go to. For young children, I don't want to overemphasize this because I'm pretty much on board and limiting screen time, but there are, for that half hour where you really need something to entertain your child.
Okay, let's be honest. In that half hour when you need a break, goals. Yes.
By deliberately, tuning into some diverse things. There's some great things like Doc McStuffins and Maya and Miguel and Molly of Denali. And Sesame Street for younger kids really has attended to diversity issues. So those are other activities that your child can engage in that are naturally going to lead to conversations.
Well, that leads us perfectly into tip number 2, which is acknowledge and celebrate racial diversity. We've talked about some of that when we were talk about race, specifically about race. But Dr. Harris, why is it important to acknowledge and celebrate racial diversity, be it through the books we choose or the media we expose our kids to in our very limited screen time, right? So why is it important to celebrate diversity?
It's important because, the conversations are great and they are a starting point, right? But the books and the activities and where you go and what you choose to, do for family time and where you choose to do it are all also implicitly communicating to your child that difference, there's nothing wrong with difference. Difference is okay. Difference is part of, human nature. We don't all look the same. And so, the conversations are our beginning point, but all of the other things that we've touched upon as entry points and ways in are also implicitly communicating that difference and to celebrate diversity, and that difference is can actually be a really good thing.
And can you suggest some resources? I was thankful that Dr. Hazzard listed specific videos and things and shows that we can use. Any others that you can think of that are part of what we're already exposed, I mean, that are commonly available that we can utilize as parents to make sure that the media our children are consuming and the events they're going to are diverse events, and acknowledge and celebrate that diversity?
So I know that. So one thing I'll talk about just as off the top of my head, Mercer Mayer is an author, and title of the book, "I Get So Mad." And I remember when my son was a toddler, I got this book because it validated his emotions and being upset. And I think they have like a whole series.
Yeah, I
So
think so. Yeah.
I enjoyed that because it helps to validate their emotions and how they feel. As we get older and move into, elementary school children and junior high school children, um, parents taking them to a local museum, or going to, and these are things that might happen with school, or perhaps in the past, pre-COVID, may have happened in school. But parents are taking them to certain places or to see certain things. I know in New York City, kids start to experience perhaps the theater, right, in junior high school, or and for particularly parents who may have privilege or have means, you have the opportunity to really expose them by going to places. The dance company, Shin Yoon, is something that I've been wanting to take my kids to, especially my daughter, for her to see different types of, dancers. So, just there are a lot of multicultural things, whether you are watching online or physically going to something to, again, foster or watch a movie or a film. And there are like tons of people who have lists of these things. But those are just some off the top of my head, that particular book. And then also, multicultural sites that might be available where you live as a way to kind of begin the conversation again and help them talk.
And our anti-racist parenting guide will have a ton of books that will celebrate all types of diversity. So I would strongly encourage you to check that out as well.
And I wanted to mention one other specific resource. There's a publisher called Barefoot Books that really specializes in cross-cultural stories, and they have they have many interesting books, but one that I really love is called Barefoot Books, Children of the World. And it has beautiful illustrations of all sorts of different dimensions that vary, like here's all the different homes we live in, here's all the different foods we eat, here's the different ways we play in different countries. So it's very concrete, but very interesting for kids to look at and see the illustrations and learn more about the different ways that people do things in different cultures, but it's also giving the message of, hey, we all eat, we all like to play, family is important to all of us, even though our families might look different. So it's a very, it's a book that kids can, it's kind of like, Where's Waldo, and that there's a lot of detail in the illustrations, and kids can have fun exploring that.
And it sounds like a fun book for parents to read to their kids. Yeah. Which, after a while, when you've been reading Green Eggs and Ham for a while, it's really nice to have a book that you're going to enjoy as well. This show is underwritten by the Jockey Being Family Foundation. Hope for the future is what drives the mission of Jockey Being Family, helping to provide crucial post-adoption support to all adoptive families so that they can remain strong and together forever. They believe that every child deserves to experience unconditional love of a family, and they aim to make that dream a reality for all. To help support them, go to their website, jockeybeingfamily.com/donate. All right, so now it's time to move on to tip number 3. And that is, and we've alluded to it briefly, or Dr. Harris did when she was talking about why one of the reasons that white parents avoid the discussion of race, and that is not being either not recognizing their privilege or being uncomfortable with their privilege. So tip number 3 is to recognize systemic or institutional racism and white privilege. So what do we mean by, well, actually, I want to know what we mean by both. Dr. Harris, what do we mean by systemic racism? And then contrast that to what, or tie that into what we mean by white privilege.
So systemic, the word, it's relating, of course, to a system or systems, right? And so systemic racism are the ways in which various systems are racist and or promote racism. And in particular, how it relates to white privilege is the fact that most of these systems, when we talk about systemic racism, are favored, right? It's fixed in the favor of a particular group. And in this particular case, in the US, it's fixed toward white people. And so going back toward the history, looking at history, but also even just looking at various aspects of our socioeconomic status, so much is coming out or coming out again as it relates to the inequality. So systemic racism are the ways in which systems that govern our country, our states, our cities, and how they promote inequality. And usually, like I said before, usually the people who are benefiting from these systems, whether intentionally or not, are people who historically are and who identify as white.
All right, we've talked about one specific white privilege, that is the privilege to remain silent. A Black family right now, or anytime, doesn't have the option of remaining silent on race. And it is through our privilege of being white that we can choose whether or not to talk about that. Dr. Hazzard, can you suggest, or can you give us some other examples of white privilege?
Sure. The privilege to go jogging or bird watching without feeling scared for your safety. The privilege of, if you're walking down the street, let's just say, as an adult, if you're driving in a car and get pulled over by the police, the privilege, you might be pissed off that you're probably going to get a ticket, but you're not scared about whether you're going to make it out of that encounter uninjured and alive. The privilege to go shopping without being followed around or harassed or suspected of doing something wrong. The privilege of not being often asked to speak on behalf of all white people. Just not having a daily toll of having to deal with stereotypes or microaggressions, sort of negative things said about you or related to your race or the group that you belong to. And here's another one, the privilege that's completely ironic to me. The privilege, as a white person, I have the privilege of escaping stereotypes, violent stereotypes accompanying my race. I mean, it's very ironic that one of the most prevalent stereotypes that's probably to some degree driving police brutality is the stereotype that Black men and boys are dangerous, or that Black people in general are dangerous. I mean, be a student of history, and white people are far more dangerous to Black people than vice versa. So those are just some examples of white privilege. And again, the other privileges for white people is being oblivious to their privilege, because we don't think of it. These are things we take for granted. We sometimes don't stop to think, oh, this is not the same for my Black and brown brothers. These experiences are very different for them.
Doc, and that raises an issue too that I sometimes hear, and Dr. Harris, I'd like for you to address, is I will talk sometimes with white people who are on the lower socioeconomic, and they roll their eyes and they go, privilege? I don't have privilege. I'm barely making ends meet. I'm living paycheck to paycheck. Don't talk to me about privilege. What would you say to them? After you sigh, what would you say to them?
So, I mean, the reality of it is that you find people across race on various socioeconomic scales, right? And so for people who are white and they find themselves on the lower socioeconomic scale, it does not remove privilege. It just means you're in a different class, but it doesn't remove your privilege, because a poor white person and a poor Black person are still working with a very different needs. And a poor white person and someone who is Black, who may be by class standards affluent, that person, that their color still does not negate the challenge that they will encounter because of the color of their skin. I have had to deal with it, still deal with it even to this day. And so I understand how they may not feel like they have privilege, but I would have to, tell them that unfortunately you may have a lower socioeconomic status, but your privilege as a person who is white still trumps in many circles that of a person of color, regardless of where they might be on the socioeconomic scale.
I think one way I approach that question, Dawn, is to acknowledge that white privilege doesn't mean that you haven't faced hardship in your life. It just means that your skin color is not one of those hardships.
Yes.
That's a great way to put it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and to acknowledge it. So, Dr. Harris, at what point, part of this is also the default that white is better. And that permeates our society. How early in life do children recognize that and start defaulting as well that white is better?
So I think it's the famous doll test. I'm sure Dr. Hazzard would know. And I know that people have repeated that again and again. I think originally some of the things that were found were as early as 3 and 4, right? I think now, and just sort of in my own experience, what I've started to see is people, both Black, white, wherever you are, girls being allowed to, and boys being allowed to have different colored dolls, which I think is great. That has started to kind of rise up. But still, I would say even as early as 3 or 4, there can be a preference toward that. And I can give you a short anecdote. My son, who's 5, watches American Ninja Warrior Jr., and he is a fanatic. And so I noticed, after bath time, for over the course of his several days, he didn't want to put on lotion. And I was just like, bruh, like, we need you to put some lotion on to moisturize your skin. And he basically told me that he wanted to be ashy in order to be white. And he's 5. And so I was like, oh my God. I was stunned, because his school, right, where he was going at the time, was predominantly children of color. He has been in other spaces where he has been the only, but I realized when I was watching the show that, he's getting messages implicitly, right, in various spaces, in various ways. So kids are noticing it as young as 3 and 4, and they begin to say and do things that show you that they are internalizing those messages.
Yeah, that would be, yes. So, Dr. Hazzard, how can parents, white parents, address institutionalized systemic racism or white privilege when their children and themselves are likely to benefit from it?
So the way I think about this question is how do we help children form a healthy white identity, which to
Yeah.
me is an
Yeah.
anti-racist identity. And one side of that is not allowing children to stay comfortable in their relief that they have white privilege.
Mhm.
So, I mean, some children, as they learn about sort of police brutality against Black people, I mean, a natural reaction is, whew, I'm glad that's, not going to happen to me since I'm white. I mean, that's an understandable natural reaction, but you don't want to stay there. You want to say, I'm glad that's less likely to happen to you too, but it shouldn't happen to anybody. It's not fair that it's happening to Black people. That's very, very wrong. And we want to work together as a family with other people to make changes so that police will treat everybody fairly and not hurt brown people either.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one side of it. And then the other side, dealing with the guilt that Dr. Harris brought up. You also don't want to stay stuck in guilt because that keeps you silent and immobilized. So, with kids, you can say, being white doesn't automatically make us bad people. Definitely white people, have done a lot of bad things in the past, and some are still doing bad things today. But, we have the choice of what kind of white people we want to be and what we want to use our white privilege for. And so let's use the power we have to make things better and fairer, etc. So that is, that's how I have approached it with my nephew, who's my do-over, since he's my race conscious do-over since I was fumbling along with my daughter at the time.
So, Dr. Harris, how do we teach our kids to understand this power and equity? So they can name it, unpack it, dismantle it, and so how do we do that with our children?
So I think one of the ways to do it is, is to, change the narrative. So, for example, trying to remember the instance that it was. So, for example, if somebody, is arrested, particularly with news shows, and, that usually is Black and brown people disproportionately are shown on news shows. The narrative, as you talk, or if a child asks a question, it becomes, well, they say, right, that this person has done something, not this person is a criminal, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think it's the language that gets used. So being Black is not a crime. Being treated unfairly is the issue. And we have to ask ourselves, why is this person being treated unfairly? So I think it's the language and being intentional about that language and being delicate so that we don't do insult to injury as it relates to explaining equity and difference. And I think if you can just say what you said again so that I can, because there was another point that I wanted to make about that.
Well, to name it, unpack it, and dismantle it. Right. I think naming it is one of the most powerful things we can do as parents. Recognizing it out loud so our children know that we recognize our own privilege.
So the other thing that goes along with that is, sort of this idea of fairness, right? We all sort of have an idea of what we think is fair. And I think there's a way in which you can, how is this fair? How is this not fair? Or if you were in this shoe, or if you were in this person's shoes or situation, would you want this to happen to you? And begin to sort of ask your child about fairness and think about your own fairness. I really think that all of these tips and tools are great, but I think also parents have to also be doing their own inner work so that they can be good guides for this. So I think that it's a combination of doing the inner work, which would seem obvious, but also I think it has to do with addressing or beginning to address this concept of fairness.
Mm-hmm. And kids are so tuned into fairness.
Yeah.
I mean, they at a very young age understand fair. And so approaching it as what is fair And even if it's more fair towards you, you could
Right.
still approach the fact, because kids get unfairness
Right.
at a very young age. Can either of you think of resources that parents can use to help with specifically the understanding of institutionalized racism or white privilege? Again, we're going to be listing some in our, and primarily many of them are books, children's books, but other, in our anti-racist parenting guide. Other thoughts on resources? Let's start with you, Dr. Harris.
So I was just pulling up a website. So there's brightly.com. I don't know if you've got that on your list. And then that has a whole list. And then there's another, the title of it. Oh, well, Embrace Race.
Mm-hmm.
They've got several, they've got a great list as well. And so specific titles, Let It Shine by Andrea Davis Pickney is one that I really like. And she talks about Rosa Parks and Harriet Tubman. The illustrations are really beautiful. For boys in particular, because they like nonfiction, Unstoppable by Art Colson. How Jim Thorpe and the Carlisle Indian School football team defeated Army. So this is about back in 1912, U.S. Military Academy, and it's great for ages 6 to 10.
Mm-hmm.
And the last one I'll mention is Separate is Never Equal, Sylvia Mendez and her family's fight for desegregation.
I like that one as well.
Okay, so you've got that one. Okay, so those are just a few that I've started to pick up. That's been my personal commitment. So something that parents can do is just slowly begin to build your library, even, on books that are age appropriate for your child, to begin to do that. That's been my personal commitment, is to slowly just build one book at a time so that we can begin to have the discussion.
Mm-hmm. And going back, books make it so much easier. And not all, there are a few books, particularly ones that are actually actively talking about racism, that many of them, or some of them, have sections for parents as well to kind of guide you through the conversation. So again, it's kind of an easy way, it's an easy intro. Dr. Hazzard, any other resources that you could think of specific to talking about institutionalized racism and or white privilege?
One I wanted to mention is Not My Idea, which is specifically about white privilege and names white privilege. And it's probably, I would say, for 5 to 8 or 9-year-olds. And then another book that's helpful, and really a website. It's the Barefoot Mommy website. Yes. And she has a lot of great book lists. And then she's also written an ebook called Raising Anti-Racist Kids, an age-by-age guide for parents of white children. So it goes from toddlerhood up through middle school, and is really great at identifying what are the issues that might be more specific to different ages, and then sort of building building the sophistication of what you're working on with your child as they get older.
Mm-hmm. And don't stop reading these type of books to your kids. Even read aloud chapter books. Even when your kids are reading, I always think it's a mistake for parents to stop reading to their kids, just because the child can read. Because it's
but also for kids reading, that there's some great books for middle schoolers and young adults. I mean, Jason Reynolds is just a master storyteller, and his books, I think, are really awakening a new generation of kids and getting them into thinking about this through wonderful stories.
Yeah, and YA books they're also a great resource for parents to read themselves. We tend to dismiss them and think, yeah, it's just a YA book. Don't. Often the stories are very good, and you too can learn. And if your teen or tween is reading them, it gives you something to talk about. It gives you an intro to the conversation, because So you could read them together, read them separately, but together, and then come together to talk.
Yeah, that's a great strategy, I think.
Yeah, it is. Let me introduce one of our partners, Adoptions from the Heart. They support this show because they believe in our mission of providing unbiased education to pre- and post-adoptive foster and kinship families. Adoptions from the Heart was founded by an adoptee, and they are celebrating 35 years of bringing families together through adoption. They are a full-service domestic infant adoption program specializing in open adoption. You can see adoptive parents and birth parents share their stories on their AFTH TV, airing Tuesday mornings. That's Adoption from the Heart TV. You can follow them on Facebook or YouTube to catch every episode. All right, now we have talking about race, celebrating differences is our second tip. Third tip is recognizing systemic or institutionalized racism and white privilege. Then our fourth tip is to talk about with your children the violence against people of color, as well as protest and resistance. We, of course, want to begin with mentioning the book that Dr. Hazzard is co-author on, and that is Something Happened in Our Town, a child's story about racial injustice. Dr. Hazzard, just briefly tell us the premise of that book.
That book is a book of our time, although it was written in 2016 and published in 2018. But it starts with some young kids hearing about a police shooting of an unarmed Black man. And then it's a white girl named Emma and a Black boy named Josh. They each go home to their respective families and ask a lot of questions and have a lot of discussion. And then at the end of the story, they have a classroom situation where they have to make decisions and see if they stand up for what they've learned about fairness in their family discussions.
Okay. So, Dr. Harris, how much should we share with our children? At what age should we start to talk to them about these hard topics? Or is it better to shield them because these really are grown-up problems?
So I think Dr. Hazzard had mentioned earlier, as we, talked about, you can start to have the conversations with them early. I think that it's about the questions and the comments and what your child is noticing. But like today, with all that's going on, if there are protests on the TV and your child is present and watching, and they ask a question, in that moment, I think parents have to take a deep breath and kind of jump in with both feet. And not to say you're going to overpower them, but it's kind of, scaffolding, you're building. And for a moment you say, well, they're talking about equal rights. Well, what's equal rights? Well, that means that we're fair, that everybody gets to do the same things. And so you begin to try to scaffold for them. So that every time you have a conversation about equality and fairness and race and protest, you can, well, do you remember when we talked about this? And do you remember when we talked about that? And then eventually there's a theme that we've been having these conversations. And then B, there's this, we've been talking about this in different ways. So I think that you can start to talk about particularly kids who are in that elementary school age, who have gone to school and going to school, especially because more often than not, they're having these experiences. We talked about the media. Kids today are consuming much more media than television. And so they're also encountering it as well. YouTube. I mean, my son watches Rebecca Zamolo, and I can name several different major YouTube stars that my kids follow. And so all of these things are messages that are being, sent. And so, I think elementary school age, that kindergarten age, those kids who are in school are a great place to start.
So Dr. Hazzard, as a child psychologist, how do we start the conversation? Let's break it up into talking about violence against people of color. At what age and how do you start that conversation with children without unduly burdening them or frightening them?
So if I had a 5-year-old, I'll tell you what I'd say right now. And I'm interested, since Yvette actually does have a 5-year-old, I'm interested in what she said. But I think I would say something like a black man was unfairly killed by a policeman during an arrest. He was in handcuffs and he didn't have a weapon, so there was no reason for the policeman to do what he did. And policemen have Black people have been treated unfairly in our country in many ways, and including by policemen. And there's protests going on, and the protests are to change things so that policemen treat everybody fairly, especially treating Black people and brown people fairly. I would have no problems saying that. In fact, I think parents should be saying that to 5-year-olds and maybe 4-year-olds. And that's essentially about the level of graphicness that's in our book. And I can tell you that, I mean, we've read our book in small groups with 4-year-olds, and then in classrooms with 5-year-olds and up. And kids, are not overwhelmed by that. They're a little surprised sometimes not. They're sad. They're kind of outraged, like, that shouldn't be happening, but they're not traumatized. And they understand that it's unfair, and it helps to mobilize their natural idealism and desire for fairness to move things in a good direction.
Dr. Harris, yeah,
I was going to say, can I just add that, and perhaps, Dr. Hazzard, I think sometimes we underestimate, children, particularly today, we underestimate them, and we think that they are fragile, and they are fragile in certain ways, right? But I think, just as Dr. Hazzard has demonstrated, and just even what she said, I thought was perfect. And, we underestimate what they can handle. And I think it's partly because we want, to hold on to a certain level of idealism, and we want to protect them. But the reality of it is that if we're not talking to them, they're still getting the messages regardless, whether it's the TV or the device. The messages are still coming in some way, shape, or form, and we have the ability and the responsibility to help shape them. And I think that just what Dr. Hazzard offered was perfect and straightforward. And then the kid might say, okay, and walk away, and that might be enough for them. But then they may come back later and say, well, why is this? And why is that? And to allow, again, that sort of scaffolding and development for continued conversation. But I thought that was really great. The kids are not as fragile as sometimes we like to believe.
I agree. I think children do have a resilience that we need to respect and have faith in.
Yes, and I would also say that even if you are convinced your child has not heard about what's happening, they probably have. Maybe not your 3-year-old, but your 4-year-old, 5-year-old, they're going to start picking up just from other kids. And certainly by the time they're in school, they're hearing some of this.
Yes, your choice is not really whether you're going to protect your child from this. Your choice is whether you're going to participate in processing this with your child.
Yes. Yeah. So Dr. Hazzard, as a child psychiatrist, keep saying psychiatrist, psychologist, at what age should children be allowed to watch the news?
That's a tough one, because I do think that kids should be protected from the more graphic images that are
a lot of the
The
videos.
news.
Yes.
And it also depends on the sensitivity of your child, but I would generally not be letting most elementary children watch the news with me. I mean, there's some children's versions of news, which means that you've got to be
intentional,
more careful and not just have the screens on all the time, or children are going to see stuff that you're not really wanting them to see. So, but middle school and high school, I think yes, and be there to process with them. That'd be my
Yes.
general rule of thumb.
Okay. And one thing I would also add when, again, going back to when we were talking about protest and the resistance to the violence against people of color, one thing that I think it's important is to make certain that we ground our kids that sometimes that anger is not a bad emotion. And
right?
sometimes anger is the right response. And quite frankly, if you look back through our history, our country was founded on anger and injustice. We had a revolution. We dumped tea, whether or not that's actually a true story. But anyway, all of that we can ground what's happening now into historic and good things happen as a result. People marched, and Martin Luther King, and we talk about Rosa Parks. We can go back and talk about the Boston Tea Party, and talk about anger being an emotion that we can use for good.
I think that's a great point. And I would have no problems with, in fact, I think it would be good for parents to videotape or save a portion of the news that's dealing with protests, including dealing with angry protesters, yelling with some righteous anger.
Right.
I mean, that is good for children to see the power of protest, and that righteous anger can fuel that and can fuel change.
Okay. All right, so we have 4 tips that we're sharing for how to raise a non-racist child. Now, do you have anything else you would like to add? Dr. Harris, I'm going to begin with you. Other things you might want to add for talking with white parents raising white kids and wanting to raise children to become non-racist citizens of this world?
I think that one of the things I would offer is that we need you, right? We need you to do this and participate. You are important to this work of building a better country and a better future. And so to just offer that first is that we need you. Second, this is a big thing for me, is to do, again, that inner work. I can't stress that part enough. So often we get stuck in the conversations and all of the ways that we can talk about and around, but unless we're dealing with the stuff that's on the inside of us. One of the things I wanted to, I realized now that I wanted to mention before, I had it in my notes, was that, parents even sharing their own story about how they became conscious or aware of race, I think is extremely important. We've been talking about stories and how stories can be so powerful. Parents testifying to their children about things that they struggle with or are beginning to understand and see differently, I think shows a whole lot. It means being vulnerable, but I think that is also helpful and beneficial, as well as building a closer relationship with your child. So, the 3 things would just really be, A, you're needed, your work is needed. We need you to parent your child, and to begin to instill values as early as possible. You're not a bad person because you were born with privilege, but you can help shape and make a more equal world. The second is to do your inner work, whatever that might be. And then third, consider writing your story. Write it in a letter if you can't say it out loud to your child. But share your own story of awareness and bias as ways to help your child learn about you as a person and as a parent. And those things, I think, can be just as powerful as all of the other many resources that we've named.
That was powerful. Dr. Hazzard, any final thoughts on how to raise an anti-racist child?
A couple of things. One is, as part of that internal work, I think a lot of that internal work is looking at your own history and your own feelings. Part of it for me, during the course of writing the book and afterwards, has been learning more about the history of this country, the true history of this country. And I think that's very helpful in helping white parents understand the details of structural racism. You hear that term, but when you when you really go back and learn, from the economic system, the criminal justice system, the educational system, then you really understand what Black folks have been up against. And then the second part is to walk the walk. Don't just do all this internal work and talking. Those are all very important steps, but then you got to do some stuff. And hopefully that's diversity in your personal life, but it can also be helping your children be upstanders, not bystanders. So talking through situations with peers that happen and helping them, have ideas of how they can stand up for fairness and not just be silent. And then another thing we've alluded to but haven't said specifically is that doing some social advocacy as a family. And that can take a lot of different shapes. It can be protest march, but it can be getting involved with community redevelopment efforts. There's just a lot of things you can do as a family to expose your child to those kinds of activities.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joy Harris, author of The ABCs of Diversity, and Dr. Ann Hazzard, author of Something Happened in Our Town, a child's story about racial injustice. Thank you for being with us today to talk about this really important topic of how to raise an anti-racist child. Let me remind everybody that the information given in this show is general advice. To understand how it applies to you specifically, you need to talk with your professional. Also, the views expressed in this show are those of the guest and do not necessarily reflect the position of Creating a Family, our partners, or our underwriters. Thank you so much for being with us, and I will see you next week.